Hi, my name is Courtney Humiston, and we're here coming at you live from the Napa Valley. And we are really excited tonight. We have a very special show. We have Cathy Corison from the Corison Winery here in the studio. We also have a live studio audience, which I've invited to come up and join us with any questions that they have. And of course, if you are tuning in from your home, and certainly if you have a glass of Corison Winery with you, we invite you to join the conversation, ask us your questions, ask Cathy your questions, certainly. Welcome, Cathy.
Thank you.
Just a little introduction. Cathy Corison is a Napa Valley winemaking legend. She's been making wine here since 1970s. She has a master's degree in enology from UC Davis. She made wine for Chapelet all through the 1980s and the first two commercial vintages of Staglin. So welcome. Thank you for coming.
It's great to be here.
So much is made of Cathy Corison's distinct winemaking style. She's known for a certain kind of restrained style, very consistent, very distinct style. My first question is just, what are you striving to make, and how would you define your style of wine?
I can tell you what I'm trying to do, or what I hope I'm doing, and that is to make wines that speak of place, and make wine in a very small little corner of the world on the bench between Rutherford and St. Helena. I want the wines to be both powerful and elegant. It's Napa Valley Cabernet, so by definition it'll be powerful, but it's much more interesting at the interface with elegance for me. I want them to grace the table. I want them to make food taste better, and I want the food to make them taste better. And I want them to enjoy a long, interesting life in the bottle. I don't ask too much.
Not too much, and we have three of your wines here that we're tasting tonight. We have an 04, an 05, and an 06, and these are all your Corison wines. And why is it that you selected this flight of wines to taste?
I love to pour verticals because it gives us so many things to think about and talk about. Starting with style, is there a house style? Do you like it? Is it consistent? And then it's a little bit of a controlled experiment. By the time I started my own project, I had a very good idea of what I was trying to do stylistically. So it's like a controlled experiment. I've sourced the same three vineyards between Rutherford and St. Helena this is the 26th vintage now, and same stylistic goals, but different weather. So three different vintages. The wines have more in common than not, but they're still distinct because of the weather that year.
So the big variable is the weather, and you would say that embracing vintage variation is something that you're comfortable doing while also trying to make the same style every year?
Well, vintage variation is one of the things that makes wine so interesting. If we could make the same wine every year, I don't think it would be nearly as interesting. So, of course, I love that. I love to see that, how the season is expressed. I mean, that's half of what's interesting about this. But they're all within a family or a house style.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and taste. I have the 04 over here. If anyone in the studio wants to taste it, and certainly if you have any comments about the wine, feel free to join us.
I love this short range of vintages because they're very distinct, but they're all terrific vintages in sort of opposite ways. The 2004 was a very small crop, about half normal crop, and it was an early season. Bud break was very early, and then the season was even but warm with a heat spell at the end, so it was very short. And the result was a wine that is lush within my style. It's almost juicy,
okay,
relative to some of the other vintages.
And how does that compare to the 2005?
Well, 05 in many ways was a bit of an opposite. It was a big harvest. It was almost a double normal vintage, and it was very long and cool, and not a single heat spike over 100, so that it is, in my mind, brighter and maybe leans more toward the red and blue end of the spectrum, black cherries, blueberries, into plum. has a beautiful perfume. It's always had a nice floral component to the nose.
Yeah. So what is something, if someone were new to your wines and tasting 3 different years, what is something specifically that they could be looking for? Is it more red fruits? Is it a certain kind of earthiness? What is kind of something that you can point to that is similar in all of your wines?
Well, I think one of the hallmarks is the brightness of the fruit. Whereas there are the purple and black fruits in the glass, there's also the beautiful black cherries and blueberries, the brighter fruit. There's always good, snappy, mouth-watering acidity. I think they're aromatic. That's important to me. I think that the tannins are very soft and supple even in their youth.
But also ageable?
Extremely ageable. Mm-hmm. Yeah, these wines go for decades. And don't just go. They have to do something interesting in the bottle.
They can't just last. They have to change and evolve and continue to be interesting. So I have the 06 and the 05 over here as well, if anyone wants to join us.
Could you give an example of something interesting that you think has developed with some of your older wines?
Come on up to the mic.
Could you just give an example of some of the interesting developments you've seen with the older wines as they've aged, and maybe how long it's taken for those kind of things to come out?
The thing I love about these wines with a little time in the bottle is that they keep their youthful fruit for a long time because of the nice acidity, but they develop a beautiful floral perfume. It's dried roses, violets, lavender, and that's what I wait for. It's a bit of a sweet spot. Depends on the vintage, but it'll go into that spot somewhere between 8 and 12 years of age, and it's a blossoming of sorts. Early on, they're very fruit-driven, and that's a peak of sorts when they're released for a few years. And then they, like any age-worthy red wine, they can sort of close in upon themselves a little bit. And then there's this literal blossoming at the 8 to 10 year range. Sometimes it'll take 12.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've tasted some of your older wines, and I can say that that's definitely what I have found as well. Cathy, I think it's impossible to talk to you without mentioning ways that you have kind of defied the trend in Napa Valley, which has been towards higher alcohol, more intense, fruit-forward, juicy, younger drinking wines. And so could you just talk a little bit about that and kind of the challenges and the determination that it has taken to continue and to persist in making the style of wines that you want to?
I'm not sure I'd call it defiance. It is probably stubbornness. I had a really clear notion stylistically of what I wanted to do when I started my project. And these are the wines I love, and I went to the little corner of the world that I thought would make the wines I wanted to make, so that I simply wasn't interested in changing my style. I think a house needs to stand for something. Fashion comes and fashion goes in winemaking, and as in anything. And there were always plenty of people that liked it.
And you've compared your style to a classic style of Napa Valley Cabernet, and I've often heard writers and sommeliers call your wines more similar to older 70s style of Cabernet. What is that? What are we talking about when we talk about a classic Napa Cabernet?
Well, for me, I love the range of flavors that Cabernet is capable of producing. And in one vineyard, you can, even in one glass, you can have this amazing range of fruit flavors. That's complexity. And I so value that and the refreshing acidity. It makes them delicious. It makes you want another glass. It makes the wines go beautifully with food. To me, it's a matter of balance and finesse. It's just more interesting.
You've mentioned something that I thought was very important, is that it's the same 3 vineyards for all of the wines that you've made over the years. So what is so important about those sites?
Well, it's what you may know as the classic Rutherford bench. It's bench is just our jargon for the alluvial fans coming out of the western hills. And those soils are loamy, so they hold moisture into the spring and early summer when the vine needs the moisture to grow. But then because we have rainless summers, categorically it does not rain, the vines run out of water on the bench or these alluvial fans right when they need to start ripening the grapes. So for these vineyards, it's at the end of July. The grapes are turning from hard and green to soft and black, and they're starting to accumulate sugar and flavor and color and then lose their acidity. That's when the vines stop growing. And if Cabernet is growing when it should be ripening its fruit, you wind up with green flavors.
Mm-hmm. So it's almost like the soil itself is controlling the growth and the pace of the vine. Does dry farming play into that at all?
Some of these vineyards are dry farmed and some aren't. They've all been replanted due to phylloxera fairly recently, and they're all irrigated. But as they become more mature, they need less and less water. And I personally have a theory that we're waiting for physiological maturity. We're waiting for the seeds to turn brown. We're waiting for the skins to mature. I don't think the vines get the right cues when they get water all the way through the ripening season. I don't think they think, oh, I better go dormant here. I better ripen these seeds, because that's all they really care about is setting their seed and hopefully being delicious enough to have a bird carry it somewhere else. So I think that they get mixed messages in vineyards that do a lot of watering through the ripening season. That said, it's very warm in Napa. It needs to be to ripen Cabernet. And there are times when the vines need some water to get them through a heat spell. That's the only time I use water.
So it's responding to the weather rather than just putting it on a program and giving it water at preset intervals. And
I need to be able to anticipate it too. It doesn't do any good to put the water on once it's already hot. So.
Well, everyone here, we have some really savvy wine drinkers. I know you've tasted a couple of these wines. Any thoughts or questions for Cathy? Feel free to join.
Actually, Cathy, we've got a tweet from Matt Dudden, and Matt Dudden's at CabFan74. His question is, actually, it's 2 questions. First, he has your older 01 to 03 cabs. In what order should he drink them? And then the second question, I'll let you think about that first.
Side by side, maybe.
Yeah. And the second one is, will the Kronos 08 last until 2029 for his daughter's 21st birthday?
Very important.
Categorically. I don't know how long the Kronos wines are going to last, but it's going to be certainly 30 years, but time will tell. So 01, 02, 03, those, age-wise, they're fairly similar. So I don't think there's a huge difference in the window. They're all in that sweet spot. They've all blossomed. They're all in a pretty spot right now. So they'd all be very interesting to drink. If I had to choose one to be the most long-lived, it would be the 01. It's my favorite vintage of the decade. So if I were to hoard one of them, that would be it. The 02 has always been more fruit driven, and I think that would be the first that I would drink sometime in the next few years. That's the 02. And then the 03, I think, will be a little more long-lived. It has good from acidity. And then the 01, who knows? It's going to be very long-lived. It's beautiful now. And along the lines of my comments about verticals, I think it'd be very interesting to taste them all at once.
I think we should do that next time.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions from our studio? Any thoughts on the wine? Well, they're beautiful, and thank you so much for sharing them.
Hi, Cathy. I'd like to ask you a question. I've had the pleasure of working with your wines in the past in a tasting. I remembered you talking about the wines and how they almost seem like a Christmas tree light flickering from vintage to vintage in a time frame. And I heard you say about a wine that might close up a little bit as it's going through its aging process. I'm still, after all these years, still perplexed as to what that really means and how would I know that? And then if I've always recommended perhaps buying 6 bottles at a time and then tasting them over time, how does that typically manifest, that type of aging process and that period?
Well, wine is alive. Mm-hmm. And I've come to think of my string of vintages a little bit like a string of lights. And I think that's what you were talking about. Yeah. And at any one moment in that string of lights, there are a couple of them that are all lit up. They're blossoming. And then they might dim, and then somebody else will blossom. But it's not a one-shot deal. It's a lot like an interesting person. An interesting age-worthy wine goes through a long life of ups and downs. So an interesting person goes through the terrible twos, and at some point it's in its dotage. But at every stage, even when they're two, and even when they're very old, they can be very interesting. And then they have ups and downs throughout their lives, and that's what these wines do too. They go through different sweet spots.
Thank you.
Sure.
Cathy, do you practice any biodynamic farming in your vineyards?
No, I hope to. I've been farming the Kronos Vineyard now for 17 years organically. Mm-hmm. And that's extremely important to me. What we're really doing is farming the soils. I love the idea of the biodynamics, and I completely buy into it. But I believe it's very complex, and I don't want to do it until and unless I can do it completely. It's a term that is often thrown around, I think, from a marketing standpoint, and that people will take little bits and pieces of biodynamics and say they're farming biodynamically, but it's really a global system. Mm-hmm. But very interesting.
And it's not something that you can take any shortcuts with either. Certainly.
I don't think so. And I think biodynamics, much like organics, are the most important thing is they get you much closer to your vineyard. You can't do it by driving by in a big pickup truck.
Yeah. Well, as we go into taste the 2009, which is your current release, I thought we could talk for a minute about Cabernet Sauvignon and about the character of Cabernet Sauvignon. And there's certainly been a move in Napa Valley towards blending wines, so a little bit of Petit Verdot, a little bit of Petit Syrah, a little bit of Malbec. Of course, this is a very Bordeaux tradition, but it's also a way to add different aromas and flavors and complexity. Is this something that you have done or you're interested in doing, or have you kept it more pure to the Cabernet Sauvignon?
Well, I can only speak to the little corner of the world where I farm, and that's between Rutherford and St. Helena on this benchland, these alluvial fans. And in my opinion, Cabernet in this little corner of the world can do everything those other varieties can do better 9 years out of 10. No question, I'm a bit of a Cabernet chauvinist. If I were making wine somewhere else, I probably wouldn't be. But there on the benchland, Cabernet is capable of this amazing range of flavors, and it almost always gets ripe. I believe that a lot of those other varieties in Bordeaux are grown because the conditions are more marginal, and they can't always get Cabernet ripe. And so you grow other varieties that ripen earlier and maybe fill in some of the holes of Cabernet that doesn't get us ripe. But we're blessed in the Napa Valley in general, but especially there in the center of the valley, in being able to fully ripen Cabernet every year. And I can say that categorically, even last year.
Okay.
We got completely and fully ripe.
You're a Cabernet chauvinist in our midst. All right, so let's taste the 2009, and I'm having a hard time deciding what to do here. Better taste this one more time. And so the 2009 is your current release, correct?
Just released, yes. So this spent 2 years in barrels, and then it was bottled, and then I held it for another year before I released it. which has become a fairly unusual thing to do, but it's important to these wines to have some time in the bottle to settle and knit and be fully ready to enjoy. They're in what I think of as their first fruit-driven peak. They're perfectly resolved and delicious. I would tend to serve food that's a little more assertive with the younger Cabernets than I would with the wines as they get older and maybe more delicate and more nuanced, perhaps.
What is your favorite thing to eat with your wine?
Young Cabernet, mine wines especially, lamb, hands down. Any old way, but hot and spicy.
So right now we're in the middle of harvest. You have actually just finished harvest yesterday, if I'm correct.
A couple of days ago.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I was hoping I could complete sentences by now.
So tell us a little bit about the 2012 vintage, kind of generally, but specifically if you could talk a little bit about what you do, because Cathy is actually finished harvesting her Cabernet Sauvignon, and this week most Napa producers that I know of have just started harvesting. If you could talk a little bit about the vintage and then what you're doing differently in the vineyards so that you can go to Hawaii now.
I think it's more site-specific than necessarily what I'm doing. Growing on basically a gravel pit. It's old alluvium, and it's gravelly and cobbly and extremely well-drained. And grape growing can be boiled down to two concepts. One is that we're balancing the growing parts of the vine with the fruiting parts of the vine, and that has to do with how much fruit a shoot is expected to ripen. And then the other thing, we spend a lot of time in many passes through the vineyard adjusting the amount of light and air that gets into the fruit. Mm-hmm. So I think by optimizing that, you optimize the ripening wherever you grow. And on these very, very well-drained soils, they tend to be very early sites. And then I pick on the early side because I want my wines to be elegant and have the whole range of Cabernet fruit in the glass. I want them to have good mouth-watering acidity. So it's a combination really of picking early on an early site.
Okay. Let's talk about that idea of ripeness for a minute. I think, and I hear often that it's difficult in Napa Valley and in other warm places to get the fruit completely ripe and keep the sugar simultaneously low. So what is ripeness for you? What does a ripe Cabernet berry taste like?
Well, I think ripeness really is different for every winemaker, and that's why our wines are all different. But for me, it is the total disappearance of any green character. It is I'm watching the vines. They need to keep working. If they're out of gas, it's gotten too hot, they're losing their leaves, I can shrivel up to any old sugar I want in this climate, but that's not true ripening. So I need to be sure the vines are working and producing flavors and sugar. And I am looking at the flavor profile. I'm tasting. I eat a lot of grapes. I'm looking at the way the skin flips from the pulp. I'm looking at the seeds go from green and soft to hard and woody and brown. The stems turn brown. All of these are indicators of ripeness for me. Mm-hmm. And
so for you, choosing the right side and then managing those vines properly is key to essentially making balanced wine in the end.
Right. I keep a close eye on the sugar only because I want my wines to be moderate in alcohol. So, my winemaking is very non-manipulative. So the grapes that come into the winery, really Mother Nature makes these wines. I don't.
So what does that mean, really? Like, what are some forms of manipulation that a winemaker would do in a winery that you've done everything you can to avoid doing?
Well, in today's world where grapes are picked very, very ripe, people can remove alcohol after the wine is finished. There are ways to do that. In other places where Cabernet doesn't quite get ripe in the world, they can remove water, again, trying to get more sugar. To me, great wine is great grapes. And I'm really not interested in all that, all the bells and whistles, because I think the very best wine comes from a great site and a great vintage.
And I think that there's like a purity and a beauty to your wines that I think can only come from making wines in such like a natural way without, adding all of those other things.
Thank you.
Any thoughts on the 2009 or questions about the 2012 growing season?
I am coming up. We do have some people that are logged in and didn't enable the cameras. I don't know, a little shyness maybe. But guys, if you don't want to do that, please text your questions, and we'll be answering them. Cathy, what was the worst ever vintage you ever had?
2011, just last year, was far and above the most challenging vintage I've ever seen. It was cold. It was cold all season, and then it rained. And we often get a little bit of rain during ripening season, and Cabernet's tough. It has loose clusters, thick skins, small berries. I was telling people halfway through harvest last year, oh, don't worry, Cabernet never rots. Well, we got rain, which is not that unusual, and then it got very humid and warm for a few days after that. And Cabernet did rot last year. And it was also so cold that there were quite a few places in the Napa Valley that didn't get fully ripe.
What was the difference between like a 98 and 2000? And
well, those were very long, cool seasons, and we were worried that we wouldn't get Cabernet right, but most people did. There were, in 2011, through no fault of anybody's, there were sites that simply could not ripen Cabernet last year. It was just too cold. So those would have been great years to have some Merlot or Cabernet Franc to blend in.
And one more question, then, because I'm just curious. What was the biggest mistake you ever made?
Oh, do I have to answer that?
Yes, indeed.
Maybe it was a Chapelet's wine.
The biggest mistake you ever made, it was a technicality, but I picked up the wrong jug of sulfurous acid or SO2 and made an addition that was too much. But time fixed that. I mean, so what else? I don't know.
You learn a lot about it. So you started to
I learn something new every day.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
All right, Courtney, go ahead.
All right, so we have, yes, please.
Hello,
Hi.
I'm Rich Reeder. I wanted to ask you about what the age distribution is like in your estates.
Okay, we're just about to taste the Kronos, but my own vineyard is one of the last old Cabernet vineyards in the Napa Valley, and I think you've seen it, and that's why you're asking the question. And unlike many vineyards in California, instead of just bulldozing an old vineyard and replanting it wholesale, when a vine dies, I replant vine by vine like they do in a great vineyard in Europe, because I very much value those old vines. So yes, there's a distribution, but out of 4,000 vines, we'll replant somewhere between 20 and 25 vines a year. So the average age of the vineyard is still very nearly 40 years old.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
That was a good introduction, I think, to your Kronos wine. And tell us what is different about the Kronos wines as opposed to the Corison.
Well, they have a lot in common. It's Cabernet growing between Rutherford and St. Helena on the bench. But this vineyard is, like I just mentioned, old. And we haven't had the luxury here in the Napa Valley to work with old vines. So I don't think we yet know how important working with old vines is. They know it in Europe. In the great houses, they don't use the younger blocks in their grand wine. They wait for many years until it makes the top wine. So that's been the most wonderful experience for me. It's been, well, it's the 17th vintage, I think, this year. To have the opportunity to make wine from truly old vineyards has just been magical. The yield, the crop is pitiful. It's a 17-year average, and I get 1 1/4 tons per acre. I don't know anybody else that would put up with that. But as a winemaker,
Cathy's Kronos Vineyard is like hot property. It's like right off of Highway 29, just south of St. Helena. It's in the St. Helena appellation, right? So it is very, very unusual for a winemaker to keep old vines with such small yield. The temptation is, of course, to tear them up and to replant.
You have to be a pretty bad business person. But that said, I, as a winemaker, I so value those old vines. They're wise. They know.
So tell us, we're tasting the 06 and the 08 side by side here. So you have the 06 here and the 08 here. And so tell us, like, what is kind of distinct of the Kronos Vineyard?
Well, if I were to describe the differences between the Corison Napa Valley Cabernet, which same soil, same variety, all in the same little corner of the world, and the Kronos, it's about texture as much as anything. There's a viscosity about the Kronos wines that is truly rare, I think. And what's especially interesting about it is this old vineyard is very slow to ripen, so it very slowly gets up to ready to pick at very moderate sugars. And so the wines go into the bottle with alcohols in the high 12s to high 13s. And it's so interesting to have a wine that is so packed and so full and viscous and inky at moderate alcohols. And I personally love that combination.
Yeah, it surprises me to hear you say that, because I've tasted a few of your older Kronos Vineyard wines, and there seemed to be more intensity in those wines. So I'm surprised to hear you say that it also tends to be lower alcohol, because for me they've been a little bit more concentrated, a little bit more intense flavors.
Yeah, it's this wonderful almost contradiction in terms, given the experience we have in the Napa Valley. And it's really, really interesting to me that you can uncouple the ripeness and the alcohol from the fullness and the richness. And that's a really nice combination. And I think there are wines grown all over the world that have this combination of being packed and full, but being moderate in alcohol.
Exactly. It's like the difference between, being powerful and being over the top. It's a richness and an intensity without being too mouth-filling, or, they're both very bright and fresh, while also like having that strength. Any thoughts or questions on the Kronos Vineyard?
Well, just that it's a beautiful vineyard and you can see it from the deck, and I'm curious what's going on new at the winery these days, and can we come and visit, and how do, what's the experience when we get up to your vineyard and that beautiful Kronos site? Well,
one of the first things we do is take people out in the Kronos Vineyard, because it is beautiful and it is very unique. And the other interesting thing about visiting Corison Winery is that there's no tasting room per se. You taste in the barrel room. So if we're racking barrels that day, you might be put to work.
I would love that.
Yeah.
The visitors are welcome.
Oh, yes. We're all day from 10 to 5 every day. We love visitors. We love to share what we're doing.
And hearing you talk about expression of site, monovarietal viticulture, selection massal, replanting of the vineyard, doesn't sound like what we usually think of Napa Valley as being like Bordeaux. It sounds more like Burgundy. I've thought about that since I've been out here, and it seems like there's much more affinity to Burgundy than there is maybe Bordeaux. I'm wondering what your thoughts on that might be.
Well, scale-wise, certainly. It's 8 acres. It's 2 hectares and change, and the whole model is very European. I have 2 people working for me full-time, and they split the time between the vineyard and the winery.
Which is, just to point out, that's different, where in California there tends to be different crews for the vineyards and for the winery. So it's very much an old world approach to have people being able to do both.
And in Burgundy, the scale is much smaller. You know, the blocks can go down to rows versus Bordeaux, where holdings are huge by our standards, by Napa Valley standards. So that's similar. Of course, we're talking two different varieties, so the flavors are different. But I'm very interested in elegance and aromatics, and I love Burgundy. So.
I guess the follow-up would be, which part would you think your Rutherford bench vineyards would correlate to in Burgundy? Which village?
Oh, you know, it's too hard to answer with the Cabernet Pinot Noir thing. They're just so different.
Expression of terroir, same as Pinot. It just happens to work that way now.
No, I do better in Bordeaux because the analogies with the Cabernet, and for me, I'm always Saint Julien-like, which is tends to be gravelier, and I think it expresses in the wine. So I love Burgundy, but one of the things I love about Burgundy is I can just drink it. I don't have to think too much about it. So apologize.
Fair enough.
Well, if we were going to go Bordeaux, then which property would you think you'd be like?
Well, Saint Julien for sure, and I love Ducru. So that would do.
You're certainly not in bad company there. Any other thoughts on Kronos Vineyard or the ones that we tasted so far from our studio audience? Yeah.
Tonight we're doing something fun. You're having us taste the 06 Kronos and the 06 Napa. What should we be looking for when we're doing comparative tastings? What should we be thinking about?
That's really interesting because I talked about how much fun it is to do vertical tastings. We're doing a little mini horizontal, and that means same vintage, different wines. And that would be if you had if you could put them together. What I think you would see is that the Corison tends to be have more of the bright end of the fruit spectrum, the black cherries, blueberries. The Kronos tends to be start at plums and go to cassis and blackberries. So it's darker fruit, maybe more brooding. And I think you would probably see the difference in the texture that I talked about as well.
Talk a little bit about that texture, because you said that was something that was distinct about the Kronos Vineyard. What is the texture?
Well, it's a physical viscosity. Mm-hmm. It feels thick in your mouth. Mm-hmm. And often that's associated with alcohol, but in this case it's not. It's other things, and I'm not sure exactly what, but there's this wonderful, full mm-hmm. feel about it. I think it's because Kronos, with the old St. George rootstock, produces very scraggly clusters of little tiny berries. And in fact, when we crush them at the winery, we have to be really careful because there's so little juice there that it'll tangle up the crusher. And so we have to operate it very, very slowly. So I think that it's concentration from that little tiny mm-hmm. berries with packed with flavor and mm-hmm. color.
And also balanced with that acidity, so you're mm-hmm. getting that concentration, but also having like this wonderful like lift on your palate where it doesn't feel like heavy, which is something that I think is so distinct and so wonderful about your wine. I think, Cathy, you would also be... Question?
Oh, sorry. Just before we have the Kronos out, we hear a lot about 07 and for a lot about 09, but one of the wines that we have is the 08. And it seems, I mean, it's such a beautiful wine, but it's a vintage we don't hear quite as much. Would you talk to us about 08 a little bit?
Well, I'll talk, and about vintages in general. Often, I believe because our history is, our tradition is from Europe, where in general the ripest vintages make the best wines. Come across the water and put a beret on and do exactly the same thing, and our conditions are very different. It's much warmer here. It doesn't rain at all during the year, so. It's just a completely different place to make wine. So, Hardy, what can you?
Yeah. So I was just thinking about just overall growing conditions for 08 because so many people get really focused on 07 and 09 a bit. But
Yeah,
08's one of these mystery vintages that.
So where I was going with that is that I often prefer vintages that aren't as ballyhooed in the press, because I think it comes from our European tradition that the best vintages will be the ripest vintages, when in fact we have an embarrassment of heat and sunshine some years and can get too ripe. So often it's the longest, coolest vintages that I like the best, and often aren't as sensational in the press or with anybody. So '08 is a lot like that. It was a vintage that it had lots of challenges. It was a roller coaster for weather, everything from, the first serious frost season we've had in the spring for a long time, and huge rains in the winter, flooding rains, and then, heat spikes, and then it got really cold for a while. But it was that really cold for a while part that I think makes me like the vintage, because it came through all of that with a wonderful range of flavors and really nice acidity.
It's stunning.
I really like it. Yeah.
So we hear sometimes vintages like that compared to Bordeaux and saying, oh, this is more of a Bordeaux vintage, or it's a chance to make more of a Bordeaux style of wine. How do you feel about those comparisons? You're saying we have the same grape, but we have completely different conditions.
Well, I think our cooler seasons are more Bordeaux-like. Mm-hmm. The difference really between Bordeaux and Napa in any vintage is that it generally doesn't rain in Napa. So everything is different. They manage the canopies differently because they're basically watering all the time, and not always when they want to.
Mm-hmm. So 26 years now. This is the middle of your 26th harvest.
Just finished my 26th vintage of Corison, Napa Valley Cabernet. Yeah, working on the second quarter century.
And what has, we've talked about some of the trends that we've seen in the wine industry, but for you, what in reflecting on the past quarter of a century, what has changed for Napa and where is it going?
Well, the part that I want to take forward with me is that we've all learned a lot about growing grapes. Mm-hmm. We've learned a lot about managing canopies. We've learned a lot about what grows best where and how. Because of phylloxera, we've done a lot of research on rootstocks. So I think we're much better farmers than we were certainly 20 years ago. And I think we've learned a lot about ripeness. There's no question in my mind that I know more about ripeness than I did 20, 25 years ago.
What has that changed compared? Talk to Cathy 25 years ago. What would you tell her?
Well, I think we were more focused on the analysis of the grapes. Mm-hmm. We were looking at structural things, acidity, sugar, the balance of the acids in the grape. Now I think we're much more focused on flavor and how the vine is growing and how that affects the resultant wine.
There's also kind of this current obsession with sugar and alcohol levels, and every time you hear about a winemaker doing something different, it's always like, oh, lower sugar, lower alcohol level. What is that all about?
Well, it all boils down to style, I think. Ripe means something different to each winemaker. And I think you need to go into something like this knowing where you're headed and stylistically. And so we're all doing something a little differently. And that's good because our wines don't all taste the same. Mm-hmm. We have choices. We all have different moods. We all have different foods. And there's room for a whole range of flavors and styles.
Very diplomatic.
Hey, Courtney, and
yes.
just to let you know, we do have Drew and Jeffrey.
Hi, Drew and Jeffrey.
And several other people who are hiding.
Show us your faces.
On the microphone from time to time, and just invite them to, now you know their names, Drew and Jeffrey.
Drew and Jeffrey, please feel free to join us. Pipe in with your questions. Are you drinking Corazon tonight? Do you have some Corazon in your glass? Have you had it before? We can hear you. We know you're there. They're shy. Well, let us know if you do. And then, yes.
Yes, I've heard you talk about collective we and your colleagues in the business, I'm sure, have influenced you and helped you. It's a communal type activity farming. Are there any your favorite, who are your peeps that you like to talk to and that you get inspiration from and that you feel are mentors and perhaps your mentee in a way?
Well, I don't know if I would talk about specific people, but one of the most striking things about the Napa Valley is how cooperative it is. We don't consider ourselves as competitors. We're collaborating. I own some equipment with another winery, and if anybody's responsible for the incredible ascendancy of Napa Valley, it would be Robert Mondavi. Mm-hmm. And not just him, it was the people there in the early days. They ran an experimental winery inside the winery. It was a complete winery with separate staff.
Inside Mondavi?
Yeah, inside Mondavi. And they shared everything they learned with everybody and just pulled all of us up. So, and I think that goes on in large measure to this very day. So we're all, I'm a member of Napa Valley Wine Tech. It's all winemakers. We meet once a month and have a technical talk. And there's just a sense of community and trying to make better and better wine, which has been really exciting.
As far as another question regarding the 98 vintage, Didier asked about it. It was a challenging vintage, and I remember the press, when we were talking about the press earlier, sometimes they have broad stroke. I remember in 98 it was broad stroke considerably, and it's a difficult wine to sell. And I remember Charles Thomas was working at Mondavi for years, and he had a particularly unique approach to that vintage, thinking, like you said, the Rutherford would benefit from the cooler years. And as it turned out, I remember one of my favorite wines was Hobbs' 1998. That acumen that started back then, moved into what we do now, and
absolutely.
Grown from those experiences and those people.
No question. And every time there's a vintage like that, we come out a lot smarter out the other side. And I also need to say that I'm most proud of the more difficult vintages because great vintage, like I never finished answering Courtney's question about the current vintage, the 2012, but it's just been perfect. And easy, and that's wonderful. The wine's going to be. But looking back at my string of lights, I'm definitely most proud of the vintages that made me work.
Nice. Good. They're wonderful.
Do the dogs have a question, maybe?
Hello there.
Hello there.
Hi, Drew.
Hi, Cathy. How are you?
I'm terrific.
First of all, we visited you at the winery back in July, and Hardy took great care of us.
Great. Hardy's here tonight.
I just saw him. Could you say a little bit about in terms of the 10 and 11 vintages, the challenges in those?
Well, both vintages were very cold. That was the start. 2010 was so cold that some Cabernet on some sites didn't get ripe in the Napa Valley, and we all thought that was about as cold as it could get until 2011, which trumped it completely. And so that was the biggest challenge, was getting grapes ripe both of those years, I'd say.
And how did you deal with those in your particular properties?
Well, I pick early on an early site. Basically, I grow Cabernet on a gravel pit, and that makes the grapes ripen early. And then I pick them at lower bricks than many.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You make it sound so easy.
Well, it's interesting because our most difficult vintages are usually vintages that the weather is difficult in the springtime. It's either cold and or rainy during flowering. And if that happens, we get unevenness. The set happens over weeks instead of days. And both in 98 and 2008, the challenge was to even up the ripening. And the only time we can do that is at veraison, which is when the little hard green berries that are really acting like a leaf and photosynthesizing turn just overnight, sort of like a switch is turned on. They soften, turn black, start to accumulate sugar, flavor, color, and lose acidity. And at that point, it's the only time we can see the unevenness. And we go through the vineyard every year and drop the laggards. So the things that are, the clusters that are still green when everything else has turned black, we cut them to the ground. Most years that's just tweaking. It's not, it's important, but it's not a huge factor. In vintages like 98 and 2008, there was huge unevenness out there and small crops. So it was very difficult to go out there and drop the crop we needed to drop. And I think that's the reason that there's a range of quality in those years.
Mm-hmm. And I would say also, Cathy, that I think in addition to it being difficult to let go of that crop, because that's something that could turn into wine that you could sell, it's also time consuming and it requires a lot of labor. And so I think that that is an indication of something that you do that is an attention to detail, that is often overlooked by other and certainly larger winemakers.
Yeah, it's yet again another pass. So we go through the vineyard probably 15 times and manipulate the way the vine is growing, each vine one by one.
You've always been a favorite of those of us in the restaurant community, and we like to have verticals of the wines and things like that. But lately, the press has been coming around, and you've been getting a lot of attention, very favorable stuff from being named Winemaker of the Year. Recently, Antonio Galoni said that you're one of his favorite wines that he tasted on his last trip. What's it like, maintaining your style, counter the press back in the old days, and then now that it's coming back around, how does that affect you?
I think I'm pretty oblivious to both sides because I can't be oblivious as a business, but as a winemaker, I'm pretty focused. I know exactly what I'm trying to do. And stylistically, it's the same thing I've been trying to do for a quarter century. I hope I've gotten better at it. So I think I just try to tune it out. It's chatter. Because what really counts for me is sort of taking a big step back and having my wine mean something, my label mean something.
So no vindication, no hey,
Well, I've got to say it's nice when people like my wine. Yeah. Yes, it's very gratifying.
Good. You work in hospitality in the restaurant industry?
Right. I've been a sommelier for a lot of time. I'm actually at Meadowood and teach wine education. And I love to use Cathy's wines as an example of what Napa Cab really is in its purest form.
And as a sommelier with the wine on the table, what is it that you like about her wine?
I think it's the transparency. I think it's the fact that it really shows where it comes from, and it's a great expression of varietal Cabernet, of the flavors and aromas and complexity that makes the grape the noble grape that it is, and also the way it shows the vintage variation. We don't think of vintages as one's better than the other necessarily. It's that one is different than the other, and when you taste these wines, you can see that each vintage has its own profile, it's characteristic that distinguishes it from the others. So, we think of vintages as maybe maligned, like the 98s we've talked about, or the 2000s, but when you taste them, they're fantastic. They just talk about what they are.
And they certainly have a place with a different style of cuisine maybe as well.
Exactly. A lot of times when you have a vertical in a restaurant, it ends up with gaps in it because people just gravitate towards the hype vintages, and we think about vintage all the time, and not so much about producer and terroir, which I think are more important. The vintage is the variable that keeps it interesting. But for me, you think about the producers that are reliable, consistent year after year, that always make good wine, and they're from great places that express where they're from. And then eventually, the vintage just kind of keeps it interesting, but you have to follow along in order to get that message.
And most importantly, what do you think of Cathy's spicy lamb pairing?
Oh, absolutely.
Non-spicy.
Non-spicy.
Anyway, but hot and spicy.
Anyway, but
hot.
Okay.
Good, I'm glad I asked. Cabernet and lamb is a classic combination. The tannins are ameliorated by the fat in the lamb, and the gamey flavors work with the complexity of the aromas of the Cabernet. So it's right on it. Absolutely.
And then as the wines age and become more delicate, I'll tend to serve things that are less assertive, maybe moving down into beef, being a little less assertive in flavors, and then preparation would become, as the wine gets older and older and more delicate, you would serve something more delicate with them and maybe not quite as assertive.
Yeah. Thank you. And then the other thing that I feel that we would be remiss if we didn't mention is because your name, in addition to being synonymous with a classic style of Napa Cabernet, is also synonymous with women winemakers in the Napa Valley. And I think as a professional, woman in the wine industry, I like to be thought of as just good at my job and like a woman who's good at her job. But I see so many articles, calling you out and pointing you out as a successful woman winemaker. How has that been?
I'm hoping that someday that'll go away, but it's been very stubborn, but probably for good reason. I think there's a recent study that shows that though people's perception is that 20 to 30% of the winemakers are women, it's really only 10%. Mm-hmm. So it's still a topic, but I hate to have it take away from what's really important, and that's what's in the glass. Mm-hmm.
Sure. Hey, Cathy, I've got a question from Eric Carr, who's one of our customers from Texas. And his thoughts or questions are, how do the wines age when they are really and not overly tannic, where a lot of people's impressions are it takes a very brawny tannic wine to be able to age, for a very long time.
Mm-hmm. And that's a serious misconception that a wine needs to be nasty and tannic to age. It needs good tannins. These wines, if you were to measure the tannins, you get a really big number, but the tannins that are there are very soft and velvety. So that does help these wines age, but way more important than that for me is the acidity, the brightness of the fruit and the acidity. Allows these wines to have a nice long.
And we have a question in from Corquette on tweeting from Corquette. And she wants to know, she's speaking a little bit about Napa Valley as it relates and compares its differences to other growing regions of California. For example, she wonders why we don't see more Cabernet in Paso Robles. So maybe you can just speak to Napa relative to some other.
Yeah. I've spent my entire life making wine in the Napa Valley, so I can't speak very authoritatively to other regions, but I can say why I think Napa Valley is perfect for Cabernet, and that is that Cabernet is one of the last varieties to get ripe. There aren't very many places in the world with enough heat to get Cabernet ripe. So that said, there are a lot of hot places in the world. What Cabernet needs, besides hot days to make world-class wine, is cold nights, because when the nights are cold, they maintain acidity, they produce more color and more flavor. So there are very few places in the world that have the huge diurnal shift. All summer, the temperatures, the fog comes in from the San Francisco Bay, temperatures plummet into the 50s, and having been in the 90s and sometimes low 100s during the day. So that's a very, very rare circumstance.
Has been placed in conference. Mute. Unmuted.
Because
muted.
What to do, sorry.
That's okay, I don't either. It's a very noisy piece of equipment here.
A little bit afraid of it.
But anyway, I think I'm not worried because I love the long cool seasons, and I'm not looking to make huge alcoholic wines. I welcome cool seasons.
And you'll continue to adapt your style to each vintage as it comes.
Well, I think of my style as being very, very consistent, but I need to get to that style. I'll need to be nimble.
Okay, thank you so much. Yes.
I have a question, Cathy. One of the things that surprised me when I visited the winery was your Gewürztraminer and other Alsace varietals, and you just mentioned Riesling. From a layman's perspective, I wouldn't see an overlap between the Riesling and a Napa Cabernet, but can you talk a little bit about how your appreciation for those wines might influence how you make wine here in Napa?
Well, I love wine, first of all. That's why I make wine, is I love wine, and I love all the wines of the world, and I think that does inform my winemaking. I think that I cut my teeth on European wines when I was a sophomore in college. I took a wine appreciation course that really got this all started, and it was French wines, and I think that my sensibilities have always been to make wines that are more elegant. That said, I make Cabernet because I'm in the Napa Valley, but I love all the wines of the world. I mean, some of my favorite wines in the world are Rieslings from the Mosel.
So you make a Gewürztraminer?
I make a Gewürztraminer. It's not from Napa. It's from the Anderson Valley up in Mendocino, a couple hours drive north. It's even cooler up there. It's even closer to the ocean. And it's old vines, a lot like my Kronos Vineyard. And I love the wines of Alsace for their combination of using fruity, dramatic varieties, but making them with French sensibilities. The area of Alsace is a hybrid in every way. It's been traded back and forth politically. The language is a hybrid. Their food is a hybrid. Their winemaking, they're terrific with food. Historically, they were totally dry and just really fun wines.
Do you have any other secret wines up your sleeve there?
Oh, I make a little bit of Cabernet Franc because one of the vineyards I sourced for Cabernet, there are a couple tons of Franc attached, and I make that separately, and I label it under a second label. But that said, it's really not a weak sister. I love it and drink it at home a lot.
And visitors can taste that in your tasting room?
For a short while. There are something like 50 cases made a year.
Only if you happen to be drinking it at lunch.
Yeah. Right. And you're very nice.
I know we're coming to the end here, but one question for you, Cathy. Who was Kronos?
Kronos, good question. Kronos was one of the Titans in Greek mythology, and the Titans were the sons of heaven and earth, and that's where wine sits for me, right between earth and sky. And I also like the alliteration of Chorus and Kronos. It sounds good.
Hey, yeah, sounds good. It's been like a poem, right about it? Not yet? John?
We'll get that going. Do you want to comment also on your label? We're kind of along those lines about the picture on your
along
label?
those lines. Wine is alive for me, and the images on my label are very old life symbols. This is a 7,000-year-old life symbol based on rain, and if we can grab a cork there. There's another image on my cork and at the top of my capsule that looks very Celtic, but it's actually from the same part of the world, which is what is today the Middle East. And this is another life symbol based on a sprouting seed. And it just talks to how I look at wine. Wine is alive on many, many levels.
Well, Cathy, thank you so much for joining us. It's been such a pleasure talking to you.
You're welcome.
And asking all those burning questions that I've had for so long.
My pleasure.
And thank you so much for our studio audience for joining us today, and for all of you who joined us from your home, and for your questions.